Hi all, I'm Professor Tina Good, and this video is going to discuss the literary device known as metaphor and how we might use metaphor and examine metaphor when writing a literary analysis. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. I've developed a PowerPoint that we can use to help facilitate our discussion. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about what we already know about metaphor. Okay, so many of you have already been taught about metaphor versus simile. And that is this idea that simile is something that you compare something else to with the words like and as. So you might say, he was like a lion. And then metaphor would just be you take out the like or as, and you would say he is a lion. But, the implied comparison is still there. Okay. And so the idea is that by examining the characteristics of the lion, we would get a deeper understanding of the characteristics of him, right? Whatever character we're comparing to the lion. And that's a perfectly fine way of looking at metaphor, but I want us to take a look at metaphor in sort of a larger capacity. So if we think about that kind of metaphor where you take out like and as and use a comparison, we're going to call that metaphor small m. And then for this, what we're going to be discussing today, we're going to call it metaphor with a capital M, with a big M, right? And so we're going to think about it more as a category of devices that include simile, metaphor, symbol, metonymy, figurative language, all of those things, right? And yet even speaks to a larger concept within a text. So it is a category that contains these things, but what it actually does is it takes a tangible thing, something that, we can touch, see, hear, smell, something, that our senses can observe, right? And then compare it to use it to understand a concept that is not so tangible, a concept that is more complex, something that's abstract, right? So the idea of love or pride or fear or, patriotism, things like this, right? That are these abstract concepts, but that to get at it, we look at concrete items so that we can examine that concrete item to get some insight into the larger concept, the more abstract concept, right? And then the idea is that by understanding the metaphor, we can then understand the concept a little bit more, because concepts are usually pretty complex. And we can get some insight into a character or the overall text. So how do we do that? Well, first let's take an example. Okay, so let's take the idea of love. Now, we've been writing about love, singing about love, pondering about love for probably as long as, there's been human expression. Um, and it's one of those things that we're always trying to sort of capture and understand. And the one of the big metaphors for love that we have used in the Western world, culturally for hundreds of years, is the rose, right? I mean, we still do this at Valentine's Day, right? You give roses to somebody that you love. And the idea then is that, my love is like a rose, et cetera, is that by understanding the rose and its characteristics, that will give us some insight into the concept of love, right? The rose is the tangible thing, love is the abstract concept, okay? So what we do is we just, sort of use our observation skills and start thinking about what are the characteristics of a rose, right? Well, we know roses are colorful, right? They're beautiful in appearance. They have a very beautiful aroma. Um, You can actually eat rose petals. They actually make rose petal jelly. It's tart. It's a little bitter, but they use it actually as an edible flower. But of course, one thing we know about thorn roses is that they have thorns, right? And those thorns, can hurt, can injure us. So what does that mean? So we know the rose to be sensual, right? But that it can hurt. It can hurt us, especially if we get too close, right? Roses now, you may or may not know this, but if you have ever grown roses, right? We know that roses on the bush, that's how they grow on a bush with other roses, right? So we can think about that. They're kind of communal flowers, right? They're very durable when they stay on the bush. They have thick stalks and they can weather storms. They can handle different kinds of climates. And they're a pretty tough flower when left in their natural environment. They are still susceptible to pests and disease. You could have some kind of blight come out and wipe out your entire rose garden. Or they're susceptible to certain pests like aphids, like some outside influence that comes in and could hurt them or destroy them. And so, even on the bush, they do still need nurturing. They do still need care. You have to make sure that, they're free from disease and that the pests are not getting to them. Conversely, though, when they are picked, they lose that durability. If you get a bouquet of roses, uh, it's very likely if there's other flowers in there, like daisies or baby's breath, or it's very likely that the rose is going to be one of the first flowers to die, right? So that when it's picked and it's taken out of its community and its home, it becomes much more vulnerable. Even if you try to change the water and, give it those little rose food, little, it's that'll help for sure. But once you pick it, it's not getting the sustenance that it needs, right? Okay, so that's a rose. That's a tangible idea. Okay, so we got that. So what does that then tell us about love? Right? How do we understand the concept of love through the examination of a rose? Well, a love is sensual, right? It's beautiful. Um, it can hurt us, right? If we get too close, do something, to the rose where it has to sort of lash out at us with its thorns. Um, it's durable if nurtured and left in its environment and in its community. Um, it is vulnerable to outsiders, right? Pests could come in and hurt that love. Other people can interfere with that love, injure the love, kill the love, right? Um, and love is likely to wilt or die, right? If cut off, if not nurtured, if not tended to, if taken away, from its strong place, right? So this is what we know about love, whether it's romantic love or family love or whatever way we're using love. If we compare it to a rose, which is usually romantic love in this case, um, then we get these concepts of love. That's how we begin to. Not just beautiful, right? We have to dig down into other characteristics of the rose and understand, like, this is also what love is. Okay? So, how do we recognize metaphors in a text when we're looking for a metaphor and we want to sort of conduct a literary analysis of the metaphors in order to understand the text? Okay, so we might look for an image that's repeated. So, for example, if it's like raining all the time in the story, the rain's probably going to be a metaphor that we want to examine. Um, an image or a central thing that is a central focus, right? Um, maybe, there's a car that's always there or a tree. Um, in um, sometimes you can look at the title and it'll have a central image. So, like a rose for Emily, right? We have a rose there. That could be a central image. Interestingly enough, there's no rose in the story, so we have to kind of play with that. But what else? In the story of Emily, there is that house, right, that she's in, the dilapidated house. That could be the central focus metaphor that we want to explore. An image or a thing that is surprising. It seems out of place. We're reading along and you're like, wow, what is that doing there? Some kind of surprising thing. If you gotta, like you're in Africa and suddenly, in the story there's a polar bear, that polar bear is going to be some kind of metaphor. Um, or an image or thing that is connected to a character. So maybe you have a character who always has a sword, right? And that sword is connected to the character. So we're going to look at that sword as a metaphor for that character and understand, the sword more deeply in order to get insight into that character. Also, a flat character, one that does not change, um, can also serve as a metaphor. Okay, so that's another reason to conduct a character analysis to see, does this character change as a result of conflict in the story or does it stay the same? If it's the same, it could be a stereotype, but also could be a metaphor for a larger concept. So let's practice then. Let's take a look at the story A Rose for Emily. And as we just talked about, right, you have that metaphor of the rose. Well, what's interesting is that there is no rose in the story. And if we have any implication of a rose, it might be in the opening of it when, they're going to the funeral and bringing her flowers, right? That's about as close as we get. So, we would have to ask like so why is it in the title? What is the rose for, right? What is the rose in the story? But we already know, right? It's the rose is love. So you could think of it as, love for Emily. What is the rose? We don't know. But we could think of it as love for Emily, or maybe it's not going to be quite romantic love if we're thinking about it in terms of a funeral, right? But maybe respect for Emily or compassion, for Emily. Something along those lines. Okay. Um, we also, though, I think that we might want to take a look at Emily. This is one of those stories that if we don't get at the metaphor, we're not going to get at the complexity of the story. Yes, we'll get the literal level for sure, but we're not going to get at the complexity and the depths of the story. Um, we already know that this story is Southern Gothic, and I've told you in other videos, right? Gothic is going to have an in-your-face message, and it's going to have a hidden message. So right away, when we start reading this and we start seeing the signs, we're going to go, okay, this is Southern Gothic. There's going to be a hidden message. But we also will get the clue from the title. There's a rose for Emily, and yet there's no rose. Something is hidden. Something is hidden. The rose is hidden. Something is hidden. And it's something about Emily. Okay? All right, so that's the title, but let's try to dig in more deeply. And in those opening sentences, we see that Emily is compared to a fallen monument. All right, so that comparison alone sets us up for okay, the fallen monument is a metaphor for Emily. We want to take a look at that idea of what a fallen monument is and go from there. Okay, so one thing that we might do is just look up the definition of a monument. Okay. And a monument, if we look up a definition of it, it says it's a physical structure or a site built to commemorate a person or event or preserve a historical or cultural memory. So again, a monument's very tangible, and we have monuments everywhere, right? They can be natural, they can be man-made, they can be artistic. We go to Central Park, we see, that great big monument. of Christopher Columbus, so a monument is a tribute, right? Some kind of long enduring tribute to a person, event, or something that we want to preserve historically. But of course, this is a fallen monument. Okay, so we have this monument that we wanted to preserve, but now it's fallen, right? And so what does that mean? That this person or this concept or this historical event, that once wanted to be preserved, right, has declined. And it's no longer in favor. It's maybe literally fallen. Maybe it's fallen as a result of war and it's been toppled because you know uh, the invaders have taken over and they want to eradicate the memory and the history of whatever that monument signified. Or maybe it's just fallen in disrepair. It's not being cared for anymore. It's not being valued anymore. And Emily, is this fallen monument. So then we would go, okay, how do we begin to understand then by looking at the traits of this monument? How does it help us understand Emily? And how does it help us understand the overall text, right? So we might look at how it's actually defined in the text, right? We've looked it up abstractly. We like, here's an objective. And then um, we look at how it is defined in the text. And if we look at the opening lines, it says, the men through a sort of respectful affection, right? So we have this idea that, a fallen monument deserves respectful affection, right? So respectful affection, but it's not very personal, right? If Emily is a fallen monument, it's not a very personal, not very connected. It's this, sort of tribute in this hard stone or whatever, but it's not personal, and it's also kind of nostalgic, like looking back. This used to be a good thing, but it deserves the respect that it had in the past. It's also a mourning of it leaving, right? Um, we might want to also look at how it is associated with the character. And, this gives us a lot of insight into Emily if she is a fallen monument. Um, but what does Emily represent, right? She is, the last of a wealthy family from the South, right? With her, then goes that family, and all that that family brought to that town. Um, but we also might want to take a look at Emily because some people would argue that Emily herself is a flat character. And actually, maybe all of them are flat characters. It's an interesting story. They might want to look at all of them as flat characters and as metaphor. And so, if Emily herself is a flat character, then what is she representing, right, as a fallen monument? And of course, one of our answers might just be, the pre-Civil War South in this particular story. And then the townspeople are the post-Civil War South. And how does that help us understand what's going on in this culture as a result of the Civil War? Um, how does understanding the concept of the fallen monument help us understand the concept? Okay, so if we are looking at how this fallen monument helps us understand Emily, we can also, how does it help us understand this concept of the pre-Civil War South? What is it suggesting about what it is, what it was, how it's being reflected in this story? And then, of course, how it helps us understand the overall story, right? So, so again, this is a story that's just embedded with metaphor. And this is very common for a Gothic story because remember, you have your in your face message, but in order to hide the message, it's often hidden in the metaphors of the story. So when you're writing your literary analysis and you're coming up with what you want to prove, the one thing you don't want to prove is that, Emily is the fallen monument, right? There's no point in proving that she is. It says that she is, and it's not an arguable statement. You don't want to try to prove that the fallen monument is a metaphor or anything. You don't want to try to prove that anything is a metaphor. That isn't going to be your thesis statement. But instead, your thesis statement should answer the question something like, if Emily is a metaphorical fallen monument, right? Then what does that tell us about Emily and her place in the society within the text? Okay, so go beyond proving what it's a metaphor and then but assume it's a metaphor and then try to go, okay, so how does this give us insight into the character and into the text? Okay, so we might go through comparison of Emily to a fallen monument. We can develop an understanding of Emily's place in society and a concept underlying that society may reveal itself, right? So by looking at Emily, right, as a metaphor for the South, as a fallen monument, maybe as a Southern belle, right? What is that? What is the text suggesting, right, about this concept and this character? And then we want to go like, okay, how is this concept being challenged and or celebrated by the text, right? What are we to think of this concept, right? Given our analysis of the metaphor being used. Okay. So then when you're writing your conclusion, what you don't want to do is sum up, your argument. Um, Instead, you want to show its relevance to today, right? So again, you were going, is it being challenged or celebrated or something else, But then in determining that, listen, this text was written 100 years ago. Why is it still relevant today? How does helping understand the text through this metaphor matter to us in the 21st century, right? Given what we are going through in our society today, why is this story still relevant? Why is it still important that we understand this story and its metaphors? And that is how you want to conclude your literary analysis when you're exploring it, when you're exploring metaphor. Okay? So I hope that this discussion and this PowerPoint helps you understand metaphor a little bit more than maybe what you might have been introduced to in previous classes, right? And think about how you're looking for tangible things to give us insight into more complex and abstract concepts and characters. All right? Have a good day.